All right, give people a minute to do that. Okay. Let me go through the agenda today, actually talk about some folks we have lined up for next week as well, just so you kind of know the flow of things, and we'll go from there. So in a second, we'll just approve the minutes if there are any questions about that. And then today is really focused on, you know, kind of woodlot owners, forest management and the like. And so we're excited to have folks, and Billy, appreciate the work you did to kind of get folks organized here. So from a forest landowner perspective and goals, Lisa Sassville from Vermont Coverts is going to be here. And then we're going to have Sustaining Vermont Forests into the Future, which is Tony D'Amato, University of Vermont. And then we'll have, you know, obviously our discussion with those presenters among the work group, and then we'll have some public comment. And then we want the work group to reflect a little bit on kind of where it's at, where it's going, and probably just broadly talk about what our kind of work is up to, you know, trying to get an update to the Climate Council in October. A few things to say about the agenda today and next week as well. Again, from the perspective of today, this is very focused on working forests. There are folks who have alternative or different views around the purpose of forests, or the way the forest should, ways that we should treat them, or forest them or not forest them. And so we will certainly have other presenters if people want, but I think this is very focused on working lands, and excited to have people here today. Next week, upon the request of many of you, I think we've got a great set of presenters lined up, as we've had in the past. So we have, whose name I'm, Jane, you may have to tell me with her name, but we have a terrific presenter who's thought a lot about biomass broadly, not so much from a Vermont perspective, but more of a national, international perspective.
That's, Dr. Juliet Rooney-Varga.
Thank you. From the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. We have Bill Mumma from the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts, as they like to say, who will be here as well. And then Jane, you remind me of the consultant who worked with the Mass recent work around biomass. Her name is Julia.
No, her name's Laura. I believe it's Heights, and Judy and Chase will pronounce her name better if I messed it up, but I believe it's Laura Heights, and she'll join us to talk about the recent policy that was passed in Massachusetts around biomass.
Exactly. So we have her as well. So we have a really nice and full agenda next week as well. Okay. So any questions about the agenda for today first? Okay, second, any additions or corrections or changes to the meeting minutes from August 24th? Okay, hearing no objections or changes, we'll consider those approved. And then let me just make sure that if you are on the work group, if you can, it's always nice to have your camera on just so we can identify folks. Folks are members of the public, which will make sure there's a chance for you to comment. You know, have your cameras off. It's just helpful to track people. We know who you are, but it's always nice to see folks. Okay, and I'm going to make sure I share my screen. Okay, so I think, Lisa, are you here? And maybe, Billy, do you want to maybe do a bit of introduction of folks if you're willing? And then we'll turn to Lisa and then to Tony.
Sure. So I think I'll let the individual presenters introduce themselves, but, you know, broadly speaking, I think today I was interested in hearing from folks who both work directly with Vermont forest landowners and who have an academic background in the kind of larger macro relationship between our forest product sector, maintenance of our landscape in a forested condition, kind of the long view there. So Lisa from Vermont Coverts and Tony from UVM were generous to offer to speak with you all today. They both have deep expertise and relationships in Vermont on these topics, and, you know, can introduce themselves when they speak. But that was really the hope today. We've really been focused on kind of narrow aspects of this conversation, be it greenhouse gas emissions, health and air quality issues, how different plants operate and the regulatory conditions they operate under. And I think this is more of a step back to think about how this conversation nests in the broader fabric of forest land ownership and stewardship in Vermont. So really thank Lisa and Tony for being here today.
Great, Billy, thank you. So Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you should be able to share your screen for any slides.
Hi, thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk to all of you about Vermont coverts. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm the executive director of Vermont Coverts, and it's actually pronounced covert, not covert.
Thank you.
And
Sorry.
and it's because a cover is an Old English word for cover or thicket. And so a place that wildlife likes to hide. And it also was started in the states of Connecticut and Vermont. So it's also a portmanteau where you combine two words like Connecticut and Vermont. So you have covert. So that's a little bit of the history. That's the fun part. It started out of extension in 1984 at UVM. And it's based on Everett Rogers' Diffusion of Innovation, where you work with community members to share information. We are a peer-to-peer network. And so the full name of the organization is Vermont Coverts Woodlands for Wildlife. And the objective is to educate landowners about sound forest management and wildlife stewardship. When you think about it, we talk about the percentage of forests in Vermont. About the numbers change over time. 75 to 80% is in private land ownership. And so it's through these landowners that we're going to see the greatest impact on the management of our and conservation of our woodlands and see them managed for wildlife. So that's really the objective, is to reach out to these landowners and just provide options and goals and have them share those strategies with their neighbors and friends so that we can see Vermont stay the Green Mountain state that we love so much. And so the idea was that everyone would rally around wildlife and learn about forest management options that would be good for wildlife and good for a healthy forest. And so the idea is to take landowners through what we call a journey. And the journey is you have landowners that are interested, they're aware that there are things that can be done, and we want to see them move to action on their land. And that's a variety of ways that we talk about what action might be. Action might be doing nothing, but action might be doing a crop tree release. It might be doing a shelter wood cut. And again, like I said, it might be doing nothing. And what the objective is through our flagship training, the Cooperator Training Program, we educate landowners about forest ecology, wildlife stewardship, and we bring in experts in these areas to share what things might happen. When I started with the program, we didn't really talk about invasives, whereas now that's on every agenda, and stewardship workshops. Invasives are really important to talk about because it does affect our forests. And the same is true for climate change. Climate change was not on the agenda in 2006, and it is on the agenda and has been over the last, I think I went back 6-8 years now, that we've been talking about climate change and what kinds of things landowners can do. And so really it's about helping landowners understand that they can set goals for their property. People own property for a variety of reasons. It could be just because they want a place to escape. It could be for nature viewing. It could be hunting. It could be for timber. And these goals can all be worked together in order to meet their objectives. We educate them about succession in the forests, and that we can set succession forward or back by the management practices that we do. So we can do things to mimic old growth and get old growth characteristics, or we can set succession back. And it depends on their goals. Are they looking to see early successional species like Chestnut-sided warblers? They might want to do a patch cut. And so we talk about what type of strategies they might do. We also connect them with the resources that are out there that can help them meet some of these objectives. So we bring in the NRCS to talk about what funding opportunities exist that they can use. We also really look at, have them thoughtfully consider their goals and objectives and what steps they would need to take to get there and who they would need to talk to understand. We really want them to use the professionals in the field, work with a forester to see what can be done and done in a thoughtful way as they look at management. As we know, there are many threats to our forests. You know, we have habitat loss, and so we educate them about what that means. You know, is it conversion and a complete loss because we're building something or paving it over? Is it fragmentation or degradation? Are we losing those successional changes? As we know from the history of Vermont, you know, we clear cut everything, and so everything's grown back into an even stage. So do we need to create different successional stages? Do we need to get some sunlight down? the most interesting thing is that when people ask questions, we often hear the answer, it depends. It depends on the site. It depends on what's growing there. It depends, do we have an invasive problem? It depends on the slope and the aspect. And so we really let them look at how there's a lot to consider when we look at managing forests and thinking about that management, and that there are a lot of different tools. You know, we do now talk about carbon pools. I think it's really interesting for landowners to suddenly realize that there are carbon pools. You know, you have your above ground, what's on the ground, what's under the ground. And so really bringing them through all of these steps so that they can make informed decisions about their property. What we like to say is we provide options, and it's not us doing any of this. We provide them with the knowledge to make those decisions, to really think about what they want to see, what they want to get out of their land, and connect them to that land through a land ethic. We always close out our training with a reading from Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac about the land ethic, about what community means, and that it's considering all of those pieces, the soils, the animals, the wildlife, the trees, as one community. So we really want them to be a thinking community. We really want them to be active on their property. We really want them to be thinking about how they move forward as a landowner, and then sharing what their experiences are. Did they have a good experience with a certain person that they're working on their land with, and sharing that? Have they considered passing their lands to the next generation? What does that look like? We don't want to see land parcelized and broken up and developed. If that's, you know, what are their goals? How do they pass it to the next generation? So we talk about passing lands. There's so many things. It's so funny. I just talked to someone. We have our training coming up this weekend, and they wanted to know, I send the agenda ahead of time, and they wanted to know, well, are we going to talk about wetlands? Are we going to, they asked about a couple other different topics, and I said, they'll come up in the conversations that we have. And of course, you can ask any of those questions. Excuse me, my mouth is getting dry and I left my water in the other room. And you can ask any of those questions, but any of these topics that we have can be semester-long classes. And so we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg. And that's why we have stewardship workshops. And we have an online library through YouTube now, because there is so much to learn. As you all know, through this whole process that you've been going through and hearing from all the other experts, there is so much to know. And so the landowners are really just scratching the surface. So we really just want to give them the tools and the opportunity to go and learn more, and to have all the different tools in the toolbox to meet the objectives and the goals on their property. You know, it could be that they want to allow hunting on their property, but there are other landowners that don't want hunting at all. And that's a landowner's choice. So we try and present choices and options to reach those goals. I don't know what else I can say. You know, we just talk about forest complexity and structure and how to get those pieces in there. We talk about how they share with each other. That's a really big portion. It's a peer-to-peer network. We want landowners to reach out and share with each other their successes and their goals. We have one landowner that's very involved with the black ash research. We have other landowners that have created wetlands on their property, so they share what that's like, how it was done, really their successes. It's an amazing group. What I love about it is they come from all different areas, thoughts, backgrounds, and they all have different goals. And they share, and it's, I don't know, I could talk about coverts and the landowners for a long time, so I'm actually not going to take up a lot of your time, because I know you have some important conversations to have. But it's really important that our landowners have the information, have the resources and the tools, the variety of tools that are available for them to meet their land management goals, whether it is opening it up or keeping it growing, however they are able to do that to meet their goals. You know, I say that word a lot. I'm feeling like I should have had a little bit more of an organized online presentation for you. But it's really something that, you know, how would products move? We talk about, we just talk about so much, and because there is so much to know. So the 3-day training is this tip of the Iceberg. We have stewardship workshops that go on to talk about all the tools. We do field walks to really keep them understanding the strategies, and that the strategies change. As I mentioned, we didn't talk about invasives. We do now. We didn't talk about climate. We're always working with the current science and opportunities to share with landowners so they can be good stewards of their land. That's the objective.
Great. Lisa, thank you. Is now a good time to take a few questions?
Sure, I'm gonna run and get a drink of water. So I will be right back.
Okay, no, take your time. No problem at all. Give Lisa just a second. And again, if you want to have a question, put your hand up, and that way I'll put you in the queue as Lisa grabs her drink of water. Jane, welcome. Welcome to your office. Okay, Jane, first to you for Lisa.
Hi, Lisa. Nice to see you. I have a question, and I'm wondering just about the role of sort of timber harvest and the role of timber harvest and the market that biomass specifically plays in your conversations with landowners, and the impact it may or may not have on landowners' continued ownership of the woodlots that they're managing.
That's a great question. And I don't say we have a conversation specifically about that. We will talk about timber management. We will talk about the various places that a woodlot product might go. So if they're doing a clear cut, some of it might go to biomass, some of it might go into mass timber. And so there's various ways that, so they understand that when they do a harvest, there's different places that the wood can go. We don't talk specifically about, there haven't been questions specifically regarding that.
Go follow-up question.
Sure, Billy, go for it.
Thanks, Lisa, again for being here. And, I think we worked a bit in the past, and it's just a really fantastic network of landowners that you have kind of sharing information and helping each other out. And it's a great model in the state. And I guess for me, what I hear you say is that the vast majority of Vermont's forest land are privately owned. Those individuals and families have a range of different objectives, but generally you're trying to help them keep their land in a healthy forested condition to the extent that they're able and willing. And that you found that there's a number of reasons why people want to do that. They may want to recreate on their forest. They may want to draw an income from it. They may want to hunt. They may want to just enjoy it. But that having a really diverse tool set to help people meet those objectives is important, and that we should really think about the implications on that top line goal of maintaining our forest in a forest condition when we make decisions about the tools that are available to landowners. Is that a fair statement?
That is a great summary, I think. It's really important that they have those tools, because we can't know what each piece of land has. As I said, it's so often, it depends. It depends on where they are. Are they in the valley? Are they in the mountains? If their objectives is to have moose and they live in the valley, it's not something that I'm going to be able to manage for here in Waltham. They might wander through, but they don't live here. They don't, and if I want early successional species, I need to have the tools to be able to get that. If I want to release a mass tree to have food for wildlife like oaks or cherry or something along those lines, those are tools that I can use to improve the habitat, also improve sequestration, because those trees are now going to be able to sequester more carbon because they're able to get into the canopy at a greater rate. So yes, absolutely. It's that every landowner has different goals and objectives for their property, and there are a variety of tools, and to have those tools available is really important.
Right, thank you. Judy, over to you.
The way I interpret what you just said was that landowners don't know what to do with their land sometimes, and so you're going to help them control it. Control what you describe as invasives, and control by being a steward of the land, a steward being a person who controls something. So I'm not sure that I agree with what you're saying. a forest can be a forest if it's left alone. It will do its own thing. It knows how to survive by itself. It knows how to improve by itself. It knows how to sequester carbon by itself. And somebody controlling it is not what needs to be. A forest is a living entity and an equal to us.
I would disagree that I said anything about control. Yes, I did say control invasive. So, all right, I would say I did use the word control. However, we are not telling any landowner what they should be doing on their land. We, as an organization, share, there are options for every landowner. For example, if they want to do something about invasives on their property so they can get some regeneration of particular trees that they would like to have, they have the option of pulling or doing other using herbicide or not using herbicide. Those are options. As a landowner, they have options. Tom McAvoy, who founded this program, would say everything in Vermont wants to be a forest. If we do nothing, everything in Vermont wants to be a forest. And so I agree with you, Judy. Vermont can be totally forested, but we are here as one of the entities that live here. And if we want to have an impact in some way on the property, if we want to enhance it for a particular species that we would like to target, there are strategies and tools that we can do that. And that includes biomass and sequestering carbon or any of those kinds of things. It's just one of the ways that we have as humans a responsibility. I would look at it as a responsibility. We never tell people they have an obligation, but they have an opportunity to do good things. And that good thing just might be doing nothing. It's depends, as I said, it depends.
Judy, follow up, Charlie. Yeah.
And that, to me, defines controlling.
Right. I think point noted. Charlie, let's go to you next.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the key here with the program that Lisa's describing is information sharing, because you know, I don't have a percentage of this, but from experience, I'd say maybe the majority of forest landowners in Vermont lack a complete understanding of what the resource they own is, right? We get people that move here from other places that buy forest land, even people who inherit forest land, and they love it. I mean, their heart is there, but they're not trained ecologists, they're not trained foresters, they're not trained conservationists. And so getting people together to understand what's happening out there in terms of ecological functions, understanding the full suite of options they have out there, and that can be passive management, it can be active management. But I think it's about information sharing and education, right? Getting people to learn more about what it is they have as a resource and what their opportunities that they have are on that resource. And you know, some landowners can't practice passive management. I mean, some of them have to practice active management in order to hold and keep that land, in order to generate the income to pay the property taxes. Some landowners practice light passive management. They harvest firewood to heat their house. So I think that the key here, though, is that it's not what the landowner is going to do, it's ensuring that the landowner has as much information as possible about what the options are and what the impacts would be. And a neat thing that Lisa touched on here is the peer-to-peer nature of this. It's one thing to have somebody swoop in from outside and say, I'm the expert, I'm here to help, right? But if you get a group of landowners together that live in a contiguous forest area or a very similar forest area with different levels of experience, and they can talk to each other about what I've done, what happened, what that meant for me, come walk on my land and see it. It's an opportunity to get landowners out there and learn more about what's happening on their shared landscape. And I think there's a big difference there between even myself as a licensed forester showing up on someone's property and saying, I got a forestry license, I'm the expert, let's do X, Y, and Z. And there's a difference between that and going out with a group of landowners together and kind of digging into that shared kind of collective knowledge. And I think that's a really interesting part of the coverts model that I really appreciate.
Thank you, Charlie. I do want to tell, I mean, the greatest story I have is a landowner from Andover came into the training, it's about 10, 12 years ago. And he just walked in, he's like, I'm so excited to learn. And that was amazing in itself. when he left, he's like, you just saved me so much time. I don't have to clean up my forest anymore. So he came with the intention of that he needed to create a park-like view through his forest, because that was what he was exposed to. And so now he understood the importance of having a forest with complexity and with downed woody debris on the ground. And so it was really just an eye-opening experience for this landowner. And so it's those kinds of sharing and those kinds of epiphanies that are really valuable.
Right. Any other questions? We have a few moments before we go to Tony. Lisa, I just had a question about like how many landowners and or how many acres of forest has the program engaged with over time?
That's a great question. Landowners, there's over 750 that have been through the program. We do it used to be one time a year that the cooperator training would occur. And so that would be 20 a year. And then it changed to 2. So it's 40 a year that were exposed through the 3-day training. But we also have stewardship workshops that are 1-day trainings that are open to anybody, cooperator or a general citizen. And so I don't have great numbers on that. I will say also the YouTubes over the pandemic increased our outreach. In addition, we don't have a good feeling, as you know, as Charlie mentioned, that whole peer-to-peer network, that sharing with neighbors in towns. We don't always know what kind of impact we have beyond the cooperators themselves on their acreage. We've asked for estimates from them, but I don't have a good number for you.
Lisa, there's a question in chat. Do you, in terms of your training teams or the workshops you give, are there people who are, say, ecologists or biologists, not foresters, who are part of that training expertise that you bring to land?
Oh, absolutely. Liz Thompson has come and does workshops and programs with us. We have biologists that come both within Fish and Wildlife and outside of Fish and Wildlife. So yeah, we have a variety. We pull on a lot of different talent. We have our own landowners come and share their experiences as part of the presentation as well. And many of them have some interesting backgrounds that share. So yeah, we pull from all over.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the group before we move over to Tony?
I guess I would just like to kind of reiterate something I said earlier, in that we're losing forests in Vermont, right? Like over the past decade, we've seen a decline in forest cover for the first time in a long time in our state. And as we've said, 80% of our state's forested landscape is owned by private individuals and families. And I would hope to think that we all share the goal of maintaining that forest cover. As we've learned through the carbon budget and other work of the Climate Council, it's our biggest asset to sequester, store carbon, and to provide adaptation and resilience to our state going forward. And I would much rather see, personally, I'm going to speak for myself as a member of this group, landowners having options to achieve goals that include forest management if they're going to keep that land in forest and steward it as a sustainable resource going forward, versus make the decision to subdivide it, to fragment it, to develop it into other uses. So I think giving those options to people are great, and it may result in different levels of management, different levels of control. But if the alternative is losing that forest cover, that to me is a really important win.
Judy, final comment on this for the moment, and then we'll go to the next.
Billy, are we losing forests because people are cutting them down?
We're losing forests because they're being converted to non-forest uses, like the houses and other forms of development.
So people are cutting them down?
Yeah.
Charlie, do you have just to Judy's question? Were you going to respond to Judy's question?
Yeah, just there's VNRC has done some great work modeling forest loss over the last 15 plus years. And it's from conversion, subdivision conversion to non-forest. And while I thank Cheryl for being here today, I would push back and say that I don't think that the data shows the biggest threat to forests is logging. It's conversion to non-forests, forests that will not come back. And we can talk about what logging does to carbon stocks and forests, and because there's bad logging out there. I've seen it. There's great logging out there. I've seen that too. But to make a blanket statement that the biggest threat to forest is logging, I think it's just not true. And I think the data supports that.
Chase, over to you, and then we'll go on to our next speaker.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Lisa. I appreciate your time and your comments and hearing about the great work that you're doing. I guess this is more of a question for what I just heard Billy say and Charlie speak to. Is there anything to show a connection between what you just said and biomass electricity generation facilities? Is there anything to demonstrate that the existence of biomass electricity generation facilities is actually preventing deforestation? Because if not, then it would seem that those statements, sort of in the context of this conversation, might be a little bit misleading. So I don't know, maybe I've just missed it. Maybe there is some sort of research out there, maybe there is something definitive, but my understanding is there isn't. And so I guess I'm just curious.
Sure. Well, I would say my understanding is that of the tools that are available to landowners to achieve their objectives and maintain their long-term stewardship, one is revenue from the sale of forest products. And the wood fuel market is a significant market in Vermont that generates revenue for certain landowners. I don't have data or numbers. I suspect that we might hear some of that from our next speaker. Charlie may have more kind of concrete understanding given his work, but that's where I'm coming at this conversation. It's certainly not the only thing that is maintaining our forests in private ownership, but as I understand it, it is an important source of revenue for those who seek that as an objective in their land stewardship.
And Chase, to your question, I'll probably turn to Jane. Do we have? I think here's what I've learned, which is probably least of anybody, is that in terms of the biomass that goes to essentially, I mean, the harvesting of wood that goes to biomass is generally not the primary driver of woodlot owners' decision, because it's often kind of the, I don't know what the right words are, secondary, tertiary product that goes. But I think one question the question that emerged that the group may want to think about as a recommendation is whether or not you agree that the existing two plants should or shouldn't close. If you were to essentially close them within, I don't know, pick a date, 5 years, 10 years, what does that mean for woodlot owners and the market for wood, and whether or not affects their ability to generate income to keep their land in forest versus have to sell it? What does it mean for those folks who are employed at the plant? So one of the questions that maybe we don't have a good answer to is, if those plants were to close down, what does that mean for a variety of actors? And maybe we're thinking about potentially as something that's is worth looking at. Chase, anything to follow up before I go on to our next presenter?
Well, I suppose, but I think that this is really just sort of a question of, if we're going to be looking at like the sources of wood that is combusted, I think we need to actually look at the full data, and rather than just looking at a small portion of where that wood is sourced from local Vermont landowners, really looking at the entire inventory, whether it's from in-state or out-of-state, whether it's from a large logging outfit, or from small landowners. Because again, just putting this into context, I think we need to sort of be clear-eyed that if the majority of the wood that's being combusted, on a weight basis, is not coming from small Vermont landowners and is coming from large logging companies, and if a good chunk of it, if not the majority of it, is coming from out of state, then some of these questions, I think, though important to consider, aren't necessarily central to the question before us, which is considerations relevant to electricity generation from wood biomass facilities. So I think that there's more to dig into here. I just would like, if we're going to have this conversation, I think it'd be helpful to have the conversation in a fulsome way with all of the information rather than just little pieces of it.
And Chase, do you have any thoughts about how to do that as we go forward?
Perhaps. I mean, as far as like the overall data, I know that the facilities are obligated to inform Vermont's Public Utility Commission where they source their wood. I believe Burlington Electric Department did so 3 weeks ago, and they listed all of the different places where the wood came from. It doesn't, and the tonnage for each source of wood. That document doesn't indicate whether the wood came from in-state or out-of-state. Quick Google searches, you can figure out most of it. And it looks like a very large chunk of it does come from New York State. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I forget whom on this call requested that information be provided for both Rygate and for
I think
McNeil.
Jane circulated it this week, didn't you, Jane? From McNeil?
I think we
For
finally got
McNeil,
it
you did?
this week, right? I think we got it finally this week, but we had been waiting. Yeah.
I don't believe this. My inbox is kind of a disaster right now. I probably just haven't seen it, but I think that those would be interesting first steps, and just determining how much of the wood is actually coming from small Vermont landowners could then be, the next step from that data.
Yeah, I'm happy to have that conversation. I think that's a great idea. I guess I would just offer, I don't see a huge difference if a large timber-focused entity chooses to liquidate their holdings in Vermont because of market forces, and that leads to subdivision fragmentation and development of those lands. So I think that's still a threat that concerns me. Certainly most interested in the impact on the network of families and individuals that own those lands in Vermont, but we're trying to prevent forest loss. So I don't really personally care who the underlying owner is.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair, Billy. I just wanted to try to place this data in,
Sure.
in conversation to a larger context.
Right. Thanks, Chase. Okay. Thank you very much, presenter. Really appreciate it. Thanks for your time and really helpful of hearing about your program. Thank you, Lisa. All right. So then, and I think, to Judy's point, this is focused on working lands. It may have a kind of an economic bent to it today. If people feel there are other and different perspectives we need to bring in terms of presenters, then I think we can definitely do that. So people think about that too, if we want to have, some additional perspectives on this. And then to Chase and Billy's conversation, there are some very fundamental questions about, to what degree and how the biomass market specifically for these two plants does affect small woodlot owners' choices, all of those things. Some things we probably just don't know yet. Okay, over to Tony. Tony, welcome. So glad you're here. You can share your screen if you want to. Just want to introduce yourself and dive in.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. Tony D'Amato, professor of silviculture and applied forest ecology here at the University of Vermont in the Rubenstein School, also the director of the forestry program. And so appreciate the opportunity to present. I am going to share my screen here. People seeing that okay?
Yes.
Okay. And as was discussed, really, my comment and presentation really will be kind of a broader look at Vermont's forests, certainly biomass and kind of markets and the loggers and the foresters that work and landowners that participate in those markets are part of the broader working lands that we have in the state. But I think, as we're seeing even into some cases in the discussion, often we're focusing in on a singular issue when we have these broader suite of values that we have from forests. Certainly, we are part of the forest ecosystems here in Vermont and certainly have the relationship with those forests, both to sustain them as well as to honor them and make sure that we're thinking about both how our local actions impact Vermont, but also might impact kind of global challenges that are out there. So to start out, really, I thought it was worth just talking a bit about a lot of the discussion that's already been happening in the region over the last couple of decades around how do we keep forests. I think a lot of the discussion leading up to my presentation really gets at the heart of the issue is that forests are amazing. And as Lisa said, if we just let the land do what it does, it would become forest. But unfortunately, we have a lot of factors working against that, particularly hard development to things like homes, solar panel fields, other things that those will not become forest again. So that's really one of the key threats. And so many of you hopefully are familiar with the fact that this has been a discussion in the region for a long time, led primarily by the Harvard University's Harvard Forest, but drawing input from scientists and stakeholders and partners from throughout the Northeast. And essentially, what this is called as wildlands and woodlands. It also includes farmlands and communities, where the idea is that we know just how important forests are as our natural infrastructure in the region. And so if we want to sustain that key natural infrastructure, something that's so central to Vermont's climate future, central to all the benefits that Vermont's lands provide, we need to think through how do we actually conserve and sustain that over time. And so the Wildlands and Woodlands vision really kind of put forth this idea beginning in 2010 that we currently are in a situation where so little of our forest is formally protected. And Lisa spoke to that. Billy even mentioned just how little of Vermont's forest is conserved, right? So much of it's privately owned. And so there's always that risk that it will become developed unless there's a formal agreement to extinguish development potential on that land through an easement. And so our forests really sit in a very vulnerable state in that we can't rely on those being forests in the future if in fact there is development pressure proceeding across the region. And so what this vision really put forth is that over the coming decades, there should be pretty broad and bold actions taken to try to conserve 70% of all of the Northeast forests, 63% of that being in what we call woodlands, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and 7% of that being in wildlands. It acknowledges that there will be some conversion, right? True deforestation for development, so conversion to homes, as well as conversion to farmland that will also be needed over time to meet our needs, but that the goal is to sustain kind of this forest infrastructure that's quite threatened. So the name of this really gets at kind of the heart of kind of what the fabric of Vermont's lands are, as well as the fabric of the region's land, and that we recognize there's key assets tied to both land that's unmanaged and permanently unmanaged, as well as land that has the option for management known as woodlands. And so these key elements really for dealing with kind of these global issues, both in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss, certainly inequity in terms of how we use resources and how that might impact both local communities as well as global communities, is that we need areas permanently protected in the landscape that allow those forests, to basically develop under kind of natural dynamics, both natural as well as novel. I'll talk about some of those novel dynamics like invasive species, climate change, and allowing them to kind of passively develop old forest conditions, strategy we talk about in an upcoming outreach pamphlet that we did with Vermont Land Trust and their partners, where we can just allow forests to age passively and develop kind of large carbon stocks. We can also use unmanaged areas to protect kind of significant natural or cultural features, as well as just a critical benchmark for us to evaluate, are we seeing changes in our managed lands that are different from those in unmanaged lands, and do we need to adjust course? A common aspect of what we call adaptive management, learning from natural systems. At the same time, we are here in Vermont. We've been here for a long time. Certainly me as a Euro-American, not that long relative to the Abenaki people and others, but people have been on this land and using that land for different resources and different values. And so we have this portion of the landscape that we are deriving things from, and currently we often think of these as places where we're deriving forest products, both traditional as well as non-traditional. And so having these managed woodlands really provides that opportunity for local economies that rely on those, our rural, unfortunately distressed economies that have historically relied on those to have a dependable resource base, as well as these managed areas, as Lisa's pointed to, really provide options that if that landowner is interested in a certain value that maybe over time would be gained over centuries through natural disturbance, but they're interested in gaining that value in the next 10 to 20 years, possibly using active management to provide those conditions for wildlife populations. And then something I'll talk about a bit more as well, the immediacy and the challenges that global change present. There are threats and stressors that in our lifetime certainly seem dire, and that people are interested in addressing to sustain those values. And so there's options to potentially actually actively manage to address those as well in these areas. So what this really was proposed for, and I think it's a great, that your questions and some of the discussion really cues this up, is that they really recognize the key threat to forests in the Northeast is deforestation and conversion to non-forest. It's very different than logging, which is, basically the trees grow back, it stays forest, right? That forest is regrowing, it's still a forested landscape. This is a area that's cleared, and then house lots go in, again, solar arrays go in, a subdevelopment goes in, a Walmart goes in, you name it. And even agricultural fields go in. And so leading up to the development of wildlands and woodlands, there's already a pretty substantial amount of forest loss happening across the region. This is just for the period leading up to the publication of that document, roughly 26,000 acres lost per year. That's a loss. That's no longer going to be forest. So take it off the table as kind of something we can even think of as working forest land. And as many of you are familiar with, Ali Kasiba has kind of worked up this summary based on Vermont's lands. And so this is a trend that she depicted over the last 15 years. So losing basically 3 times the area of Camel's Hump State Park over that time period, but lost, again, completely converted to a non-forest condition. There's been some gains, so possibly some afforestation of agricultural areas, but unfortunately those that are gaining hope in that trend, if you put in the most recent estimate of forest land in Vermont, actually we've lost land again. And unfortunately that recent estimate is 2020. And if you drive around any ski town or really Chittenden County, the last 2 years have not been friendly to forests in Vermont in terms of hard conversion to non-forest. And so the amount of development pressure, all of us know the amount of immigration into Vermont from folks that are buying second homes, tearing down current homes, making bigger footprints. And so, we continue to lose forest land in Vermont and at this accelerating rate. So if we look at kind of where we're at relative to the goals of wildlands and woodlands, so trying to protect, in the case of Vermont, 75% of our forest in a permanently conserved state. That is basically conserving forest so it can never become anything but forest in the future. Where we currently sit, this is kind of the breakdown. I haven't included the agricultural land because we're really focusing on forest here. Where we currently sit is that 23% of Vermont's forest is conserved. That basically cannot be developed. Most of that is the Green Mountain National Forest, Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation land, as well as certainly Vermont Land Trust, some other easements, Upper Valley Land Trust easements, as well as the Nulhegan Basin and other Department of Interior properties. But generally, the majority of Vermont's forest land is not protected right now, right? That private land. And so if we just go percentage-wise, which is a bit deceptive because it's not factoring in that we're actually losing forests, so the denominator in this percentage is going down, sadly, over time. But if we were to try to meet that goal by 2060 of having 75% of Vermont's forest land permanently protected, right? So it's no option for development. We would need to basically quadruple the current pace of protection happening in the state right now. And so when we're talking about, what's happening to our lands, how the lands are being managed, what's interesting is so much the emphasis right now in discussion around Vermont's forests is how public lands is being managed. Ironically, those public lands are protected, right? Those lands will not become solar arrays, they will not become house lots, but we have a huge area where we have a major basically this debt in terms of protection. Those private lands where we really need to be thinking about how do we kind of mobilize and ensure that those forests are there over time. And so this is a key challenge that faces us as we think about Vermont's forest future. At the same time, the other reason why wildlands and woodlands was proposed is that we do use wood. We use it in so many different ways, and certainly we use too much of it, and I'll talk about the need to reduce consumption, but we use it. And ironically, at the time of the publication of Wildlands and Woodlands, there was a lot of discussion around kind of the inequity and kind of some of the environmental justice implications of just how much of the wood was produced in New England as opposed to produced elsewhere. And it was motivated by this document called The Illusion of Preservation, another Harvard University publication that really spoke to looking at, in this case, the state of Massachusetts, where a very forested state, right? 66% of the state is forested, but only 2% of the wood that they use in that state came from Massachusetts, right? So 98% kind of net export of their needs to other parts of the globe. And so there's a lot of discussion around, we use wood, we're in a very well forested region of the globe, but in many cases, we often are exporting our wood needs elsewhere, right? And so as much as we talk about being kind of a local hero and using local wood, in many cases, we really globalize kind of that production and really rely on other parts of the world. 46% to 49% of our wood production globally comes from plantations, right? There are no plantations in Vermont, right? So just think a little bit about that, just how much is coming from other places. Likewise, leaving local examples, here's a pack of firewood from Latvia in the Home Depot in Williston, right? So we're in Vermont, plenty of local firewood producers, but we're sourcing Latvian firewood. Think about the carbon implications of bringing wood from another country, as was brought up in terms of that pellets. So we've been kind of following this and looking at kind of how we currently sit as a region in terms of this illusion of preservation, right? Protecting, eliminating all logging in your backyard, but still using wood, right? So kind of that challenge that you're just exporting your consumptive needs elsewhere when you do that. And so we've worked on a publication again with Harvard Forest as well as Brandeis University that's coming out in the coming months, where we worked up for 2020 kind of the ratio of how much wood is used by each state in the Northeast relative to how much they actually harvest in those states. And my apologies to Rhode Island. The scale on this is just they do cut wood in Rhode Island, but it's the scale is just so small. What I've also shown here is just a map of carbon stocks, across the region. And so if we look at kind of the ratio for each for New England right now, New England as a region, right? As much as we focus in Vermont, we're part of a larger region that certainly wood moves around that region. People kind of come and go and have second homes in Vermont that are from other parts of the region. So as a region, we basically are a net importer of our wood. So 65% of our kind of consumptive needs are met by forest removals, kind of harvesting in the Northeast. If we look at kind of the ratio of how much we're growing relative to what we're removing as a region, we're growing, 2 times as many trees as we're removing. Not a big surprise, kind of looking around our landscape. Looking at Vermont, we actually, are a little bit better than the average, right? So 83% of what we consume, we actually can kind of counterbalance by the fact that we are harvesting. And so we're not, perfect, but we certainly are better than maybe Massachusetts or Connecticut, but nevertheless still well below that. And what I think is worth pointing out is we look at the state of Maine, they are removing 4 times as much as what they consume as citizens of Maine, and as a result, their growth to removal ratio is closer to 1. And the reason I point this out is that when we look at this and say, well, we'll just kind of maybe up our production and think through about kind of how we balance this out, we really rely heavily on other places like Maine. And if you look at this carbon stocking, we look at state of Vermont as a reason why places where there's lower levels of harvesting have been kind of viewed as kind of key areas in carbon market development. We really often kind of create these conditions elsewhere where there's heavy intensive management offsetting that consumptive needs happening in other parts of the region. And so I'm pointing to New England, but more broadly, so much of our wood comes from the Pacific Northwest, from Central America, from other parts of the globe. And so when we're looking at kind of not cutting wood in Vermont, right, we're really, if we don't stop consuming wood that same day, we're just kind of practicing this illusion of preservation where we're just exporting those needs elsewhere, where oftentimes there's less environmental protections and kind of major challenges in terms of the environmental justice and social issues that come from that. So how do we deal with some of this? Number one, we need to reduce consumption, right? We use way too much wood. We just think of just how much cardboard we're using right now with shipping. And of course, none of that is being produced in Vermont, but at least a little bit's being produced in Western Maine. So we can feel okay that there's some local production of cardboard. But in general, we really are consuming at a pretty high rate forest products. Likewise, I really appreciate the discussion about where the energy is coming from, because I think there's very little incentive right now to think through what are the substitution benefits from local wood. So first off, wood relative to fossil fuel intensive materials like steel, concrete, obviously has tremendous carbon substitution benefits. But if it's local, those benefits are even greater, right? So that article about wood pellets, of course, if you put wood pellets on a ship and send it all the way to England from North Carolina, think about how much fossil fuel is being burned just to get that fuel there. Likewise, if I'm getting a 2x4 from Oregon to use in Vermont because I don't want 2x4s to be produced in Vermont, the carbon footprint of that material when it gets here is certainly a big issue. So this graph here is just showing kind of substitution benefits of different materials. And the one I really want to focus in on, this is for mass timber, right? So engineered wood products. And so substituting that for steel, right? Kind of basically the CO2 benefits, we're fixing 10 kilograms per CO2 for every kilogram of wood fiber used relative to that steel. So offsetting that impact. What's ironic is someone that works in Burlington and walks around and looks at construction. Since I've moved here, which is in 2014, every new building built in Burlington that I've looked at is loaded with steel. And so I'm wondering, as much as I'm a Patriots fan, I hate to kind of link this to Pittsburgh, but I'm wondering, do we need to change it from the Queen City to the Steel City? If we really care about carbon, we really care about climate, we should be appalled that we are building high rises out of steel, in high rises by Burlington standards out of steel. The only wood in this structure, the only renewable resource is basically the temporary railing they're putting up to keep those workers safe. So thinking about kind of that local and how that benefits carbon is really critical. I think the other aspect of it is that if we want to have kind of working woodlands that allow us to actually meet our local needs, a key aspect of it is that we need that workforce and the skilled labor in those communities to actually kind of do that work. And so whether it's loggers or folks that are able to work in mills or people that are able to work with kind of value-added wood products, as we lose markets and as it becomes harder and harder to make things economical, we're losing that workforce. And it's hard really to convince somebody to get into logging at this stage in the game, just given both how it's not often viewed as favorably as farming or other land use practices. So certainly there's a stigma to it, but it's also brutally hard work. And so thinking through how do we kind of retain that workforce. So I'm going to transition into talking a bit about the future and kind of what we're dealing with beyond just the challenges that we are losing forests. We use wood, and so we have to kind of rectify both how do we sustain forests and how do we deal with some of the impacts of our consumptive behavior, and get into talking a little bit about just what the threats are to Vermont's forests. Again, looking at the roadmap and some of the discussion, a lot of it is around like resilience and adaptation and having working lands that can address these challenges over time. And so part of having those local markets, some of what we discuss as it relates to managing for changing conditions is that again, I respect Judy's comment that, you know, given centuries, you know, millennia, forests will reassemble and we may be have buckthorn mixed with other species and so forth. And it's a forest, and from an ecosystem service standpoint, it may ultimately, you know, provide some of those values that we currently enjoy. But in the near term, there are threats, whether it's emerald ash borer, drought, invasive species that are threatening the values we have, whether the cultural values of basket material for ash, or just the aesthetic values related to certain species being in the forest. And so in many cases, there are landowners or agencies that are interested in, can we do adaptation actions to enhance or at least enable greater levels of resilience in those ecosystems in the near term. So most of us are familiar with the challenges facing Vermont. It's kind of interesting. Since I moved back to the Northeast, I lived in the Midwest for 7 years as a faculty member at the University of Minnesota. And out there, drought, you know, is talked about a lot. And when I moved back here, you know, again in 2014, people were like, drought, not that big a deal. And then now we've had how many droughts over the past, 8 years. And so, you know, we're really starting to see more and more in terms of drought impacts. Thankfully, we've had rain the past few days, but again, another abnormally dry year in Vermont. And so when we look at changing climate, increasing frequency of extreme precipitation events, both too much rain as well as too little rain, and then just look at kind of the composition of Vermont's forest. This is based on kind of the dominant tree species currently in our forest in the Northeast. What this is showing is kind of the tolerance to drought of those species. So the lower the numbers, so the hotter red means lower tolerance of drought. And what that really reflects is that historically, Vermont is a region that drought hasn't been a big part of our ecosystems. And so most of the species that dominate here are adapted to cool and wet conditions. But as we see these conditions, you know, increasing into the future in terms of drier and warmer, there's a level of vulnerability there. A better way to look at that in terms of just how things might change in the future, this is a map of if trees could walk, wish they could, and track the rapid rate of climate change occurring. They can't. But if they could and move to where the climate is presenting itself as new habitat for them in the future, the Northeast is really viewed as a kind of a hotspot of places where, there are many species that could gain suitable habitat because it's going to get warmer and drier over time. And so when we look at that, it really is reflecting that, you know, this is a region where currently there's not a lot of kind of local species that might do well in the future under climate change, but that in the future, things like oak and hickories from further south might, if we were to plant them here, do better just under that change. Similarly, besides being a hotspot for kind of change in terms of composition, we also, as many of you already know, are a major hotspot for non-native invasive insects and diseases. This map was based on data from 2013, so it doesn't even include beech leaf disease, which really looks pretty scary in terms of the impacts it's having in Connecticut and elsewhere. But it's a region where, again, you know, if we weren't here creating these challenges, the forest would be in great shape. But we continue to have these novel dynamics that are threatening our forests over time. So there's a lot of discussion around, you know, are there ways for us to deal with these grand challenges? Can we adapt, you know, these ecosystems, you know, or find ways to kind of deal with these novel dynamics? And in many cases, if we view ourselves as part of these ecosystems, in many cases, we have an obligation to those ecosystems to honor the gifts they provide us and find ways to kind of, you know, work with those systems to deal with these challenges over time. And so I'm going to just talk briefly about kind of the ways people are thinking about adaptation, and then just give a couple of examples of what that might look like in terms of forest management activities. And so one way people think about adapting to climate change is that we need to be finding ways to resist all these changes. You know, are there ways for us to do things to the forest now that will basically keep it healthy and happy and essentially be the exact same forest as it was in the future? And a great example of a resistance strategy that many of you have likely taken part in is pulling buckthorn or pulling garlic mustard or pulling honeysuckle out of your backyard. You're essentially resisting that change, right? Again, if you were to allow that to just develop on its own, it's going to create a new novel forest with trees in the overstory, hopefully, and buckthorn in the understory. But that's different from potentially the forest that you currently have today. And so one approach might be, can I actually kind of manage that forest in a way that resists those changes and enhance the vigor of the trees and so forth? The term we often talk a lot about in terms of global change is resilience. And so can I, you know, manage that forest or kind of encourage conditions that, although possibly changing over time, might be able to better absorb and respond to future changes. And so if I have a forest that's all the same tree species, let's take a pure sugar maple stand, I know that forest is highly vulnerable to something that specifically targets sugar maple. And so might I have a mix of species, like diversify that forest or change the age structure of that forest in ways that might provide many mechanisms to recover. And to some of the comments, earlier, the forest in Vermont has been highly simplified by that historic land clearing for agriculture and kind of that recovery. And so in many cases, we're dealing with a forest that some of these resilience mechanisms are still not present, just given that simplification. And then finally, what people also talk about is maybe I should manage to transition that ecosystem. And so in the future, I know that oak is going to be better adapted to this spot than spruce fir. And so do I think through, are there options where I might want to plant some of those species or shift things in ways, or in some cases even restore historic conditions? So those that work in pine barren ecosystems, those are historically maintained as open barrens through indigenous burning. And so do I try to restore those back to those open conditions that might be better adapted to drought or other stressors? And so thinking through how we go about doing those things. So all of these rely on management, right? So whether it's invasive species control, even treating a few ash in your neighborhood to keep them alive, that's a resistance strategy. But generally, when we're talking about kind of shifting ecosystems, so altering the species composition, the structure, management's a tool for doing that. And so again, as we get into this describing kind of stewardship and adaptive management, really, these rely on the ability to conduct forest management on lands and do them in a way that is acknowledging these stressors. So just to kind of draw on some examples of kind of how people think about this and just how basic management kind of intersects with aspects of these strategies. On the left-hand side, I just have a graph showing kind of resistance to historic drought. So this is 2001. Some of you may remember a very hot, dry period in the Northeast. Again, it would be a wet year for somebody living in Flagstaff, Arizona, but a dry year for the Northeast. And what I have graphed here is an index of resistance just based on the level of impact of that drought, both on growth as well as kind of levels of mortality, relative to how dense that forest was. So like how many trees were in that forest and what was their arrangement. So on this one side, these plots represent forests that are managed using uneven age management. So these are forests that have multiple age classes in them. They've been managed for several decades. I mean, on the right-hand side, these are forests that are unmanaged. These are not pristine forests. These are areas that were historically industrial lands. So it's kind of coming back as these dense areas that are often characteristic of portions of the Northeast Kingdom and other places. And so if we look at kind of the impact of that drought event, kind of look back in time on those forests, what we generally see is in these areas where we were managing them in densities that might approximate those found under some natural range of variation, there was much less impact of that drought relative to those high density stands. And again, it makes sense if you think about resource availability, the more trees, the denser the forest, the more competition for those resources. So as a result, during these stressful events, those can be challenging. And so broadly, when we think about adaptation, a lot of it is that we recognize the importance both of thinking about kind of resource and how the resource availability and how that might affect kind of levels of stress in the forest, but more importantly, that we need complex forests, right? Forests that have multiple species, multiple age classes, living and dead trees, in both at the stand scale as well as across the landscape scale. And a lot of this really relies on what we call ecological silviculture. So using an understanding of that natural system to guide our stewardship and to try to restore as well as enhance complexity of the forests that are out there. What I think is tricky is that we get fixated on a single objective and really want to focus on the here and now and might not factor in just how dynamic forests are and how that might impact long-term vulnerability of those ecosystems to changes in what's happening across the landscape. And so carbon obviously is what we talk a lot about now, as Lisa mentioned. It's a newer topic, but lucky for forests, we've been measuring it for a long time, and so we can really understand kind of what's happening out there. And what this graph is depicting is basically for the entire US, what we did is summarize the conditions in current forests based on if they were eligible to be entered into the California Air Regulatory Board carbon markets, as well as if they were kind of meeting standards that we might view as kind of ideal situations for management. And so on the left-hand side, these are just 4 different kind of broad groupings of forests. So softwoods on low quality sites, softwoods on high quality sites, hardwoods on low quality sites, hardwoods on high quality sites, et cetera. And these are tens of thousands of data points going into this figure. And so what the left-hand figure is showing you is the rates of mortality, right? So how much tree death is occurring in forests that actually currently would be eligible for entering into the carbon market. So what you might notice is that those that meet the carbon market standards, right, these orange lines actually have very high levels of mortality, right, which speaking to the fact that these are very dense, highly stocked conditions. And thinking about it broadly, Western forests with fire risk, certainly even some of our kind of dense forests where we have a lot of self-thinning mortality occurring. So even though today we look at that forest and say lots of carbon there, in terms of a long-term kind of vulnerability of that carbon, there's a lot of risk and mortality associated with that. using the exact same data, looking at this through the lens of forest management standards. So standards like I showed in the previous graph, where we're actually managing to ensure there's adequate resource availability across that forest, there's diverse structures. We look at mortality rates in forests that would meet kind of our management standards, they're quite low relative to those that don't. So it really points to the fact that relying solely just on kind of carbon stocking as our metric of what is good forest management might be ignoring some of the unintended consequences over time in terms of the vulnerability that might present in terms of long-term carbon stability. So this is a good way to really put you to sleep, but bear with me on this graph. I had a master's student, Tessa McGann, who really looked at kind of the social dimensions of climate change adaptation and interviewed foresters across the region, both public foresters, tribal foresters, private lands foresters, and talked to them about kind of what they viewed as the primary challenges right now they were facing, how they were adapting to those challenges, and then what some of the barriers to those challenges were. And so I'm going to highlight some boxes in a second so you can stop squinting then. But basically this column here are the kind of key challenges they're seeing to sustaining forests over time. So it should be no surprise: lists of invasive plants, changing precipitation, et cetera. The adaptations they're using to address those challenges, the barriers to those challenges, and then kind of some potential solutions. And so the thicker the line, the more respondents in these surveys actually answer that. So I'm going to focus in on silvicultural prescriptions, so doing management on the ground in response to climate change, and many of that was a common factor that most managers recognize as how we might adapt forests to climate change. And what I think is worth pointing out is that in many cases the barriers to doing adaptive management were not lack of information. How do I do kind of an adaptive stewardship? And there's been a lot of training around that, including through covers. The key barriers really dealt with kind of economics. Do I have the markets and the ability to even do these treatments? So something we've been talking about, today, kind of that broader working lands. Again, if we eliminate a market, let's just say biomass, I don't think there is the data to prove that would prevent forest conversion, but it certainly would limit the economic viability of many harvests, and certainly impact the ability for forest management to occur in some places. And so certainly that's one issue. A big challenge many brought up was public perception. And so again, there's a general sentiment sweeping the Northeast that we shouldn't be harvesting trees in general, right? Regardless of land base, even though I recognize the emphasis has been on public land that has been more broadly I think ascribed to many other lands. And so as a result, just the ability to do forest management now, I think is really being impacted by just the general that logging equals deforestation, which it does not. And likewise, just markets and labor. So when we think about adaptation, it's not really about, do we have the knowledge necessary to manage for the emerald ash borers? Do we have the markets? Do we have the social license? Do we have these other things that really are critical that I think we need to factor in? The last thing I'll bring up, and Lisa mentioned this, and I've talked about carbon, and carbon gets emphasized a ton, as it should. Forests are the best thing on land for carbon, right? So first off, let's keep forests. We really need to make that the battleground. We lose forests, we lose that carbon benefit. But the other thing about forests that's amazing, and I think all of us recognize this, is that they are multidimensional. There are so many things we get from them: aesthetic values, cultural values, provisioning values, clean water, clean air, just the backdrop of Vermont. And they're also dynamic, right? They change over time. And so what happens in one spot today, might be great for a certain species or great for a certain benefit for 10 years, and then it's no longer great for that certain benefit or species. And so we might need to be shifting practices across the landscape. And so I think what's a bit discouraging in kind of some of the current discourse is that carbon has become the only objective that some are interested in, or the primary objective used to kind of forward an agenda. And really, we need to recognize that in some cases, there are some strategies that we manage that are going to have trade-offs with carbon as kind of a goal. And so one prime example is for early successional species, if we think about, again, that we are members of this forest ecosystem in Vermont, and we have an obligation to those species in the system. Historically, we had things like, large populations of beaver, large populations of indigenous people that were creating openings and doing things that supported some of these early successional species. Likewise, we had many areas of forest that had developed under centuries of natural disturbances that were providing the values that late successional species needed. And so in some cases today, those conditions aren't currently present. So we need to actually do management if we want to sustain those species over time. And so what this figure is showing on the left is just based on the breeding bird survey, kind of the trend in chestnut-sided warbler, species we know does rely on young complex early successional forests. And so the red and orange kind of just points to areas where the population of those species has declined. Again, as Lisa mentioned, kind of maturation of our forest and kind of the loss of those natural agents, right, beaver and kind of cultural practices to maintain those conditions. So if I were to do management, again, kind of create complex early successional habitat here, that's obviously going to be great for chestnut-sided warbler. Get out your Merlin app, you're going to hear the species out there, within the first couple of years. But at the same time, at the stand level, I'm reducing the carbon stocking in that forest, right? We all know that when we cut mature trees, we're reducing the amount of carbon in that forest on that site. But in the broader perspective, I'm kind of enhancing kind of wildlife and species diversity at the landscape scale. By having that diversity of forest conditions, I might be reducing vulnerability at the landscape scale to kind of large scale forest loss. And as a result, I'm enhancing that adaptive capacity. And so when we're dealing with these challenges and thinking about Vermont's forest future, it's really looking at it in this multidimensional space, not just in kind of the here and now, kind of one current issue, and not factoring in kind of how those dynamics play out over time. And so to think about this kind of in more of a stand level, let's look at a forest stand. Here's a 50 acre area, in northern New Hampshire that's being managed in different ways. So this is 50 acres and this is 50 acres. And so we have areas that are not being managed. We have areas that are being managed with what we call single tree selection. We have areas being managed with what we might call group selection, and then areas that are being managed with a regular shelterwood. So really putting you to sleep with the silviculture terminology here. All these, right, are not deforestation. Thankfully, this is permanently protected forest land, right? So it will remain forest. These areas that are an acre in size will have trees come back in them, right? So again, it's not deforestation, right? It's forest staying forest. But there are certain differences, right, in terms of how this forest is being managed, as well as differences in terms of the values coming from that forest. And those not familiar with LiDAR, this is just kind of showing the height of the forest. So the darker the value, the shorter the forest is, right? These are gaps in that forest. So in those areas that are unmanaged, right? So these could be our wildlands over time, as well as in those areas that are managed with ecological silvicultural practices that favor and emulate kind of single tree fall gaps, so we call single tree selection. Those are the spots in the landscape at the stand scale that have the highest level of carbon storage. It's indisputable, right? There's more trees out there, there's bigger mass out there. They also, because of the nature of those forests, are going to have the greatest abundance of interior species. But at the same token, have the least level of adaptation potential, and primarily because it favors kind of one suite of species. Lisa mentioned kind of getting light to the forest floor. These types of harvests and really the unmanaged condition is really going to favor, shade tolerant trees, sugar maple, hemlock, spruce, fir, beech, right? All wonderful tree species, but all certainly carrying with them some different vulnerabilities to climate than others. On the flip side, in these areas where they're doing both group selection and irregular shelterwood, lower levels of carbon storage, right? Again, indisputable. We've reduced the amount of biomass out in that forest. At the same time, and we have loads of bird data to show this, even in 1 acre openings in these areas, there are chestnut-sided warblers, there are mourning warblers, there are other species moving into those areas that were not present prior to that management that are gaining some of that habitat, including pollinator species that rely on some of those early successional plants. At the same time, these are areas where we have other species regenerating that, like oak, that have greater adaptation potential, and so providing kind of those opportunities out there. The point being, there are trade-offs with any management we do, but we really need to be thinking about that as we're ascribing kind of any single objective to any part of Vermont's landscape. So just to wrap up, we all hopefully can agree that forests are like the biggest, most important thing to Vermont's climate future. Besides us and what we do, right? We naturally, forests are the key, but we're losing them. I mean, we are losing forest, and it's permanent loss. Again, this is conversion to non-forest. And we also have these challenges beyond that conversion, like non-native invasive insects and diseases, non-native plants, climate change that also are threatening just the nature of those conditions. And so when we think about resilience of ecosystems, kind of the natural resilience of ecosystems really builds from all those parts, right? Kind of keeping all those cogs and wheels, as Leopold talked to. And so having that diversity of mechanisms to respond, but also the diversity of options from a market standpoint that allows us to even have the loggers, the workers, the millwrights, others that actually sustain these communities to allow us to actually have these adaptation options. So I think, as we evaluate biomass or any market in Vermont, which are largely limited relative to other states to begin with, having that diversity for local options really gives us these opportunities as well to do a lot of management. And I think we really need to be drawing that connection, local markets, tied to what we consume, right? We consume a lot of wood, and we need to really own that as we talk through not cutting trees, we consume a lot of wood. So where will that come from? How does that impact those communities? And how does it factor into some of the other goals that we have for the landscape? And so if we really want to have resilient, healthy, and just forest ecosystems, right? Ecosystems that are factoring in just kind of the impacts of our decisions, both locally and globally, we need to be really making these linkages between kind of what we're doing in Vermont and how that's affecting both our local forests as well, as well as our regional and global impact. So I'll stop with that, but certainly look forward to any questions that folks might have.
Great. Tony, do you mind just taking down the slide just so we can
Yep,
see?
happy to do that.
Great. So questions for Tony? Judy.
I appreciate you talking about silviculture. As you know, that is a native way for caring for the trees in the forest, and that there is balance. One thing you talked about was adaptation. And for us, it's traditional to adapt to social, political, environmental, and economic changes. What are, so for instance, the loss of ash because of the emerald beetle, the traditional techniques used in basketry with ash could also be used with maple and hickory and oak. So that would be an adaptation. Also, there are 4 techniques. The ash is only one plating, but you could use other materials to do the other 3 techniques. So there's varying adaptations that can happen. You didn't really address economics and adaptations in other areas like economics or political, or how would you respond to that? And I also have the question that Chase asked earlier, which is how does this connect to cutting trees in our forest for biomass?
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning, and I should have more squarely acknowledged that there is an amazing legacy of adaptation and continued adaptation with Indigenous peoples, certainly in New England, but more broadly in North America and around the globe. And one of the key areas we do work in, and we're very fortunate to partner and learn from tribal partners on this, is the loss of brown ash or black ash, and to your point, so using oak or even box elder or other materials, reed for basket material, and so that adapting to the cultural kind of loss of the material loss, but also kind of the loss of that mature tree being in the forest, and that being able to go to like the full process of going to the forest to harvest the ash and then deriving the material, and so it's honoring that whole life cycle of the ash and what it gives, and so it's a tremendous challenge that I think you bring up points of adaptation similar to the loss of chestnut and kind of how that Haudenosaunee and others were impacted by that in terms of that staple, and so even some of the adaptation that we work on with those partners discusses thinking through culturally significant species that may be there's no substitute. I would say there is no substitute for black ash, but that may substitute for aspects of the gifts that species gives. And so I think it's a great point. In terms of the economic adaptations, in many cases, when we look at Vermont and kind of our forest landscape and kind of what we do really rely so much on other places, for processing our wood, as was brought up, of course, it's just over the lake. So New York is a source of a lot of the material for, McNeil. And so I'm sure if you look at Reigate again, given its proximity to New Hampshire likely be an option. And then we send wood to Maine and New Hampshire and certainly to Quebec for processing as well. And again, it's a kind of a legacy of relative to other states. We just haven't had kind of the level of development of forest products industry that for better or worse, people can debate that. But just so in terms of adapting, in many cases, part of what we're doing, is thinking through other ways to scale both the processing to the communities that need them. So if we look again at our distressed communities in Vermont, I think most of you are familiar with the Northern Border Region Commission reports on distressed communities. Those really intersect pretty strongly with those communities that have historically had working lands that are primarily forest lands, as opposed to the Champlain Valley and other areas where, as many of you know, it remains agricultural lands with those primary uses. And so thinking of ways to adapt emerging markets, whether it's mass timber, which unfortunately looks like Maine's going to get most of those plants because they already have the infrastructure for that. But other things like wood insulation, opportunities there for different value-added products for wood that would keep the wood in Vermont, keep the jobs in Vermont, and keep that carbon footprint down. Again, just thinking about that life cycle and that we are using wood. How do we, generate that? And I think from a policy standpoint, really trying to reinvigorate, which was a good period of time, ironically from 2000 to 2007, where there was a lot of incentives and cost share for conservation easements and a lot of federal money going into protecting private land. And so basically, many of you are familiar with this. So you're a forest landowner. You still want to own that forest land, but you basically sell the development rights. And so basically can never be developed. It still can have other uses, but it can't be developed. And so finding ways that go beyond current use, which obviously is a 10-year agreement, that is not protection, right? It's an intermediate level of protection, but it's not saying you can't develop your land for 90 years, right? It's saying you're entering into an agreement for 10 years to get this tax break. And so finding policies and ways to really work with private lands and that can conserve that base. Because right now, whether it's home development, and again, there's a nice new parking ride, I guess, coming in Williston, right off the highway, permanent clear cut, right? There's going to be asphalt. We need places to park cars, but thinking through, like how are we actually doing some of this development and limiting fragmentation? Many of the views I take from places like the Green Mountain National Forest, I'm focusing in on that one house that was able to develop on that middle of the hillside. That's not happening on the national forest. That's happening on private lands. So trying to really and I know there's been a lot of discussion around that, limiting forest fragmentation and trying ways to do that. But I think, we really do need to think through just like, and I guess one final thing is, can we not allow developments to occur that are 100% steel sourced from all over the globe, right? I mean, it's just a base in the city of Burlington, right? So, can we think through finding ways to work with architects, finding ways to work with, other firms, and what I think is a key connection there is that using that mass timber to build affordable housing, right? So it's not just the crisis of carbon, the crisis of climate, but the crisis of we have so limited affordable housing in the region. And so can we try to solve multiple issues with a more carbon friendly building material than just throwing up another concrete or steel building in the region? So I think that's a ramble to your response, Judy, but I think that there are many things just to think more broadly about Vermont's working lands. Who are the people working and depending on those communities? All of us, I think, depend on some of the resources coming from those communities, and how do we localize that and scale it to Vermont? Because we're not going to build a new, mill. It's just a giant mill. We might build a beautiful state-of-the-art brewery that that industry we're good with, but we're not going to do that with a mass timber facility. And so how do we think through other ways to be thoughtful about that? And I guess my final comment, even on the adaptation standpoint you first brought up, is that there's a lot of regional discussion too, as terms of finding ways to stockpile basket material and other ways for kind of regional use from tribes. So kind of giving access to those areas, restoring access more appropriately to private lands where there's brown ash, to public lands, to allow that material to be harvested and basket splints to be pounded and stored for future use. And so finding ways to coordinate that, I think both locally and regionally, is critical, just given, as the nature of the structure right now in terms of quote unquote ownership.
Great. Judy, any follow-up to that? And I'll then take other questions.
Well, you didn't, thank you for that. But you didn't answer the question about the connection with biomass.
So biomass, and I think, as we talk about biomass, these are facilities that are in Vermont, right? And so there are loggers and there's forest harvests that are occurring in a landscape that is a portion of the market that is allowing that to be sustained. And so if you look at a lot of work that Renee Germain has done in New York State, and Steve Bick. They've done a lot of work looking at how do loggers even stay in business, right? You think about the level of overhead they carry in terms of the expense of that equipment, the insurance and so forth. It's a very cost heavy, profession, as well as super hard and super dangerous. And again, definitely not revered like other working lands professions, unfortunately. And so what he's generally shown is that for these loggers to stay in business and to actually maintain not only their business, but also like a living and a home and a house, and whether it's Linden, Vermont or wherever, they need to have at least some level of profitability of a sale, and that really relies often on diverse markets. So if they only were selling wood to Srisasimo and Brattleboro for solid logs, there are only so many forest harvests that even fit those specs. There are only so many opportunities for sales that those people would buy, and so having access to McNeil and Rygate really provides that opportunity for those loggers that are kind of using that as part of what's local to them as an economic component of that portfolio. And so it's not like there's no forester or logger that they're just biomass. It's all they do, and that's obviously procurement foresters for McNeil, it's part of what they look at. And so it's really having that as part of the portfolio of options, similar to if you have a farm, you need kind of a range of things you're selling off that farm. Having that diversity of markets that allows you to sustain the overall enterprise there. So there's not, as I mentioned, in my presentation, any data point that says, excuse me, the lack of biomass means forests are going to be converted to non-forest. But there's plenty that points to the economic viability of the logging industry relies on a diversity of markets. And in Vermont, we have very few markets. Again, even look at the number of sawmills our state has. We have the same amount of sawmills as Massachusetts, I think. So just to kind of put that in perspective, and New Hampshire has about 4 times as many as us. So, within the state, kind of serving our local communities, trying to minimize the amount of fuel that logger has to use. And ironically, there's now some work even looking at electrified logging equipment, all these different things. There's so that the industry is certainly trying to progress with greenhouse gas issues, but trying to keep that certainly local relies on there being markets that aren't all the way over in Maine or aren't up in Quebec or aren't being shipped to China or other parts of the globe. So that's so it's part of the larger picture, Judy. It's not like biomass is why this person is in business. It's part of the reason why they're able to make ends meet over time.
Well, for me, it's all about finding balance.
Agreed.
Tony, I guess I just want to push a little bit on that last point Judy made, and I'll go to Chase and Adam, because I'm still, I don't think we've seen, or I've heard the argument for why a biomass for McNeil and Rygate as a piece of wood, of kind of income for woodlot owners as they sell their wood. It's not a primary, but it's kind of a secondary, tertiary source of income. But I still haven't heard, if we close those plants tomorrow, I'm not saying we should or shouldn't, what that actually does to woodlots. Does it accelerate conversion? Does it reduce things so people lose land because of tax not being able to pay? I don't have a sense yet that we have like a really detailed study to understand the impacts of what that would actually look like.
So the landowner, as Lisa mentioned, is often working with a forester, or often they will also sometimes work directly with a logger without a forester, but they have something that they're doing on their land, whether it's like I mentioned, we should be coming out in the next few weeks, a publication on how to manage for old growth conditions, right? And so some of that's doing nothing, some of that you could actually do harvesting and management in that stand to accelerate old growth conditions, or they're creating early successional habitat. So they have that goal for their land, but the only way that goal is achieved is actually the management occurs, right? So you could say till you're blue in your face, I want my forest to be the best thing ever for chestnut-sided warblers, or the best thing ever for scarlet tanagers, and these are the ways I'm going to get there. But if there's no logger willing to buy that wood because they can't figure out a way to make that economically pay, then it's not going to happen. And so the payment to the landowner, yes, is definitely, certainly helps to, pay taxes, certainly, offset the cost of ownership. But the key bottleneck is less there. It's more, are we actually able to do the management without that diversity of markets? Because if we don't have loggers, and if we don't have kind of cost like forest sale of forest products that are appealing to them from a market standpoint, then they're not going to buy the wood. And over time, we're likely going to lose some of those loggers just because it's just economically not worth their while to try to make it happen. So if I'm say sitting in, Groton, Vermont, and I'm a logger in that area, having Rygate there means that literally in a very short trucking distance, I have a market that I can actually make a pretty good, profit from that material from. Whereas if I'm sitting in Groton, Vermont, and the closest facility for the wood that would likely go to biomass is, Rumford, Maine, or Jay, Maine, I might not even bother bidding on that sale because it's going to cost me so much to do that. And so as a result, whatever that landowner wanted to achieve is just not going to occur. And so it's really part of the broader toolbox of forest management that, if we're hoping to do things, whether it's thin the forest, reduce the impact of invasives, again, accelerate certain habitat conditions, and that relies on management, there's an economic dimension to that, but it's really on the economics. Is it operationally feasible? And that's really comes down to, does a logger, have the access to the markets they would need to provide those options. So it's less like the landowner is not going to get paid for biomass, and so they're going to turn that into a parking lot. No, it's more the landowner, has these goals for their land, and again, more broadly, we have these goals for Vermont forests, that we're hoping that they can, if we want to talk about another successional characteristic, and again, which is great. Our forests, there's a lot of great work for decades that has shown within 15 years, it's pinch every other species that are back. It'll be it is a forest over time. If they want to do those things, they need to have economic options for that logger to make that work.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Chase, and then Adam, and then Charlie.
Thanks. Tony, really appreciate your time and your expertise. Thanks for coming in. A couple sort of high-level questions. I wanted to ask about the benefits of storing carbon in wood that's used in construction as a replacement for steel specifically. I just wanted to sort of gut check a couple of assumptions that I had there. That use qualifies for storage because the wood remains solid, right? That the carbon inside the wood remains inside of the wood, and that's why it qualifies as carbon storage. Is that right?
Yeah, there's several aspects to the substitution benefits, as you're probably familiar with. One is just a life cycle, right? And it's it's kind of what the level of energy needed, the raw materials, right? Are we mining,
Right. But just at a high level, without getting too into the weeds, the reason that qualifies as storage is because the carbon stays inside the wood, right?
Yep. And and so that there's definitely some benefit to that being like a dimensional wood product that's going to be there forever. And so if you participate in carbon inventories or carbon markets, if a certain part of the harvest is going into solid wood products, you actually can count that towards the storage benefit because of the residence. Yep.
Right. Okay. And when wood is burned, the carbon that's inside that solid wood gets emitted into the atmosphere. Is that right?
It does. Yep.
And when carbon enters the atmosphere, it causes climate change. Is that right?
It does. Yep.
Okay. So I just want to make sure that we were understanding the difference a little bit between using wood for construction and burning wood for energy.
Yeah. And I think I think the worst statement ever made by somebody was that bioenergy is carbon neutral. I think it's carbon better than fossil fuel, right? And those that say coal's better than biomass, they're looking at like the actual kind of the level of energy you can get from a pound of coal versus a pound, right? Like digging a hole in the ground and like excavating fossils and burning that is a little different than like harvesting a tree that thanks to our environment they're growing back, and so you're emitting that carbon, but you're over time regaining that carbon on that site, but it's carbon better. So I view biomass as not a 100-year solution, right? It's kind of this bridge as we get to kind of more advanced renewable energy. But whether it's flooding areas for hydro, mining rare minerals for solar or for lithium batteries, I mean, they all have impacts, in terms of the life cycle and so forth. And so I think it's emitting carbon, but relative to the carbon life cycle impact of coal, it's a better, source. It's not.
Does Vermont get a lot of its energy from coal?
What's that?
Does Vermont get a lot of its energy from coal? Do you know?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. That's what I thought. Yeah, we often.
I'm just saying it in terms of the caricature that's been painted over and over again between coal. So I'm not trying.
Okay. Yeah. No, I just wanted to clarify that because we hear that comparison a lot, but Vermont doesn't really get energy from coal, so it's not necessarily very helpful here.
Right, yeah, we get it from hydroelectric, which also, methanogenesis and other issues that are associated with like flooding large areas too. So I mean, there's a lot of dynamics at play.
Okay. Thank you. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Go to Adam and Charlie, and then maybe a public comment, and then we'll kind of see where we're at. And Tony, thanks so much. So Adam, over to you.
So yeah, thanks, Tony. I really appreciate your comments and expertise. I guess kind of coming back to what Patrick was probing at earlier in terms of land conversion and the value of biomass to landowners. If you could just talk a little bit kind of more directly on the relative stumpage value that landowners get from biomass, like $1 a ton versus the board foot stumpage you get paid for saw logs, what that differential is and how that feeds into the economics. And then also just, if you could just talk real quickly on, the principle of high grading. I think we've been alluding to that, but no one's actually like laid out, in the absence of low grade markets, if there's only, high quality markets and landowners are doing, how that impacts not just your ability to carry out a sale or a management plan, but what the land ownership turnover rate is and how that's oftentimes considered a precursor to fragmentation and conversion.
Yeah, and I can't speak to the delivered to landowner stumpage, but if we look at just relative to reported stumpage, off the top of my head, again, I defer to Charlie or others that are closer to this. As that my response even speaks to whether it's clear or not. I'm not I don't work in forest industry, and I'm an objective academic, and that's kind of what I think is so critical for all this. You're looking at $5 to $2.50 to $5 per ton for pulp or fuel wood, relative to depending on the species, 200 to 400 per thousand. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely it's a small amount. So it's really more about the economic viability for that logger, right? And that's what I keep. It's really part of that. That there's are markets that they're participating in. I think in some cases there are also certain sales that might be kind of a break even. The landowner is not getting rich, but they're still getting the treatments they're interested in happening on their land. That would not occur if that logger didn't have access to a market that takes for wood that's not suitable for like veneer or lumber and so forth. So
great.
And then I guess the other question was about high grading. So yeah, we are often when we think about forests from an economic standpoint, the highest and best use is you're trying to grow like veneer saw logs or large pine that can go into dimensional lumber. And so when we look at any average forest in Vermont, maybe depending on the stewardship and historic development of that forest, even without any management, like an old field white pine stand, obviously, might not have much more than 15% of that stand. That's what we consider suitable for those higher quality products. Others might be 30 to 40%, 45% in those class, at least potentially for those classes. And so over time, if we only focus on those markets, and somebody does what we call high grading, which is just kind of a term for just taking the best trees from an economic standpoint from that forest, and they might not be the best for other reasons, but they're the best for economic value, and then leaving the rest, which is unfortunately been a very common historic practice in some areas. You're left over time with a forest that certainly economically is of lower value. And part of the issue is that there's no market for that wood that wouldn't qualify for that kind of higher use. And in some cases, being able to do, Lisa mentioned crop tree release or other management practices to accelerate the growth of those trees that, Chase, to your point, would go into dimensional lumber. That would be storage. Relies on the ability to thin the forest or do some sort of management that might remove trees whose market primarily would be biomass or another low value market. So those. So you can't just have a saw log industry, and at least not in Vermont. I mean, Oregon, they can do it because they're growing Douglas fir in plantations. Again, we use a lot of that Douglas fir from those plantations in Vermont. And then they're like, pulp or biomass is kind of an afterthought because just economically, loggers can just deal with the big lumber out there. But that's just not the situation we have here in Vermont. So we don't want high grading. We definitely don't want that. So don't want forest loss. Don't want high grading. Yeah.
Charlie.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, to the economic question, I think it would be interesting, and I can try to do a little digging to look at kind of if we have the data about income from saw timber versus biomass and how that stacks up against the whole picture of income out of the forest and what that means for landowners and the forest economy. But I think in general, I just want to say that when we think about this question of like, if we took the biomass market away, would landowners lose out on millions of dollars that allow them to hold their land and carry it forward? I mean, I'd say no, right? I mean, most of the harvests that we do, biomass is a very marginal layer of the income generation on top of that. And income does go to the landowner. I mean, as it's been pointed out, like stumpage rates for that are pretty low, like $1 a ton, right? And so that might mean another $500, another $1,000, depending on the scale of the timber sale. So the landowner does realize additional income from that, which does do all the things we talked about. But where I would say it really comes into play is for the logging force that we have as an extremely marginal business. This past summer, that was illustrated no more so than I can remember with fuel prices going up. I mean, to say that loggers are out there basically responding to market conditions to liquidate things to make all this money, it's just not true. Biomass markets, I would say, are literally the market that allows the greater whole to continue in some cases. And so it's not a case of if you peel that layer back, a landowner loses a few hundred extra bucks. It's if you peel that layer back, it's like a big block of Jenga, right? You pull out that one piece and things can start to collapse. And so I'm not saying that that's the only part of it, but there's this nuanced element of part of that stack, and that's helping support that stack. And so just conceptually, I think that's important to think about when we think about economics. It's not always about the individual big numbers we kick around, it's how those big numbers fit into the overall capital stacks that we're talking about. And then just quickly, I just want to just make a point that we've talked a lot about early successional habitat and cuts like that as it relates to biomass, but you can generate biomass from doing some of the structural complexity enhancement work in our forests that we talk about. So when you think about biomass, it's not just looking at clear cuts or large patch cuts or things like that. There's a diversity of silvicultural treatments that we use that can produce that. And we can talk about the pros and cons of each one and what kind of landscape, but we shouldn't be connecting early successional habitat, chestnut-sided warblers to McNeil and Rygate. That's an oversimplification about forest management and markets.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Okay, so I wanted because of time, I want to see if there's some public comments. And then I want to kind of just take the last maybe 5-8 minutes, just talk about kind of where to from here, particularly and the drafting group as well. So if you're a public member of the public want to raise a comment, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. And we'll go to that next. And Tony, by the way, as Billy just said, thank you so much. Really appreciate the presentation and the back and forth questions. So thank you. And you may get a few more here as we go. So Cheryl, over to you.
Hi, thanks for all that. There was a lot of really interesting information that you shared with everyone here. I appreciate it, especially the emphasis on the fact that it's not only a carbon situation that we have. But one thing that I wanted to ask specifically is whether you are looking at the loss of whether the study that you're referencing when you talk about the loss of sequestration when logging, comparing to coal, because coal is not sequestering before it's burned, and the trees are, and they're sequestering and storing. Not only above ground, but below ground, and cutting will remove the below ground storage as well.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the plants and animals that went into that coal, I mean, in terms of historically to create that material, and then even I guess thinking about like taking a mountaintop off or digging up material to get that coal. Unless you're doing like some pretty intensive reclamation work to get trees growing back in those places where they're kind of ripping that coal out of the ground, that the sequestration option for that spot of earth that we obviously have a finite amount of area to rely on for sequestration has really been reduced. So in a forest that might be harvested for to Charlie's point, there's a range of reasons for harvesting, and so if we go to the extreme, right, an area that's in Vermont, 5-acre, 10-acre opening patch cut, right? So all the trees are removed from that forest. Let's just go to an extreme. For the first 5 to 10 years, depending on the ecosystem, even though that forest is regrowing, right? There's some carbon being sequestered. At the same time, there's some decomposition occurring, and so that the net balance is that forest might be releasing some carbon initially, but by age 10 to 15, the regrowth of those trees is strong enough to kind of counterbalance that, and then over time, by age 15, 40, 50, 60, kind of hits the peak rate of growth, right, at the stand level. And so that's the high sequestration, like the fastest rate that forest will ever take in carbon. It still takes carbon in, and more importantly, still stores carbon. But that same kind of recovery I described, like when we're digging a hole in the ground to get coal out, that's not part of it. So I guess that's how I look at it. Is there, so in terms of is there a science paper that's gone into like all the way down to that part? I'm not aware of, but it actually probably, it just through that conversation, I would conjecture that it would make biomass look even better than coal than it already does in terms of the relative fossil fuel impact. But I'm happy to pass along some life cycle work that's looked at like coal, versus biofuels in general. To show again, to Chase's point, we're not using coal in Vermont, but just kind of more broadly, it's often used as the counterbalance to biofuel as something that's worse. So that's how I look at it. And even the communities like where we're putting those holes in the ground, how that might impact those the livelihood, the well-being, the health of those communities. I think there's potentially, again, just conjecture. I'm not looking at any data on this, greater maybe environmental justice issues and impacts of where coal is occurring versus trees being cut.
Okay, I guess there are conflicting studies that I've read as well, but I have another question or comment actually, is that I keep hearing people talk about early succession and, we have quite enough early succession. I put this in the chat, but I just wanted to say it out loud that we really do have a lot of early successional characteristics, as people talk about old growth characteristics, but we don't actually have much actual old growth and mature forests. And we don't have the species that are that correspond to those as well. And we do actually have we have actually too much edge, and I don't believe we need more. So that's another thing. Logging, I just wanted to bring this up, and that logging and development really shouldn't be pitted. They're both problems, and there are answers to those. But I guess this area is we're just talking about, trees and forests. But putting, there's another answer to putting parking lots in and development, but that logging and forestry and management is also an impact. So we're managing for the young. We don't have enough old and mature in this state or even in this Northeast. And I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the estimates, based on some of the work across the region, at the time of European colonization, anywhere from 85 to 90% of the region was forested, so there were open areas that were not forested, or shrublands, and areas again that were maintained by cultural practices like indigenous burning, as well as I think we really don't ever acknowledge just like what was the beaver population at that time, and and the level of meadows and open lands that beavers were creating, and the places that we then ultimately created our towns and villages. And so obviously we don't allow beaver, and certainly we sadly very rarely honor the cultural traditions that maintain some of those landscapes over time. And so I fully agree, and I think we have a lot of ecologically young forest, right? So a 75 to 80-year-old forest is not a mature forest to me ecologically. Right.
Yeah,
economically, that's an economic definition. So I'm a little bit disappointed to see them now being linked, because ecologically, that's a young forest, right? That's 1/4 of the lifespan of our trees. And so to Charlie's early comment, a lot of what we talk about in our management is, 75, 80-year-old forest really doesn't have the conditions that an old growth forest has in it. And we know, to your point, that was such a common part of our landscape. and so many species, and more importantly, cultural values and aesthetics relied upon that. And so we can certainly wait 100 years or so, 150 years for kind of natural processes to ultimately start gaining back some of that old condition. Or on some areas, we can decide that's a priority. We want to accelerate those conditions, use, Charlie mentioned structural complexity enhancement. Said a few times, we have a pamphlet that's coming out for landowners and the general public on kind of restoring old growth conditions. We published in 2007, kind of the first outreach pamphlet, really targeted towards, at the time it was called Keystones, or it shifted to Keystones in Massachusetts, but it was coverts as well. And so I fully agree. And so I think there's again that role for both unmanaged areas to kind of passively get there. Again, they're largely not in an old growth condition, right? Because it's such a rare part of our landscape. And then there's opportunity to work with those economically mature, not ecologically mature, right? 75 to 80-year-old forests, to actually accelerate and enhance those, and so kind of create those conditions over time. And so, that's kind of really a key point as we think about what we're looking for values.
Let me do this just because of time. Cheryl, do anything else? I'm gonna go to Zach, then we need to wrap up. So
I have one quick question. I won't comment on the creating the old growth conditions. I do have a lot to say about that, but I won't comment on that right now. But one thing that I do want to bring up is the fact that because of the overpopulation of edge species, we have a really difficult time in having forest regeneration occur the way it should. Because of our overpopulation of, for example, deer. So, and other issues, invasives, et cetera. And there's a lot more to say about that, but I won't comment on that anymore. I just want to really bring it up and have everybody know that it's a serious issue, and leaving the slash behind is not preventing deer browse and other things. So that's it. I will finish. I'll turn off, and thanks for coming. I liked a lot of some of what she said, some of it.
Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah.
Thanks, Cheryl. Go ahead. Zach, I think last question of the day, and then we'll just do a quick sort of next step. Zach, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Zach Porter. I'm the Executive Director of Standing Trees. It's good to see you all. Thank you for continuing this important conversation. I'm sure it's been, I know it's been a great deal of work over the last number of months. I'm glad that we had such a detailed presentation today to spark a lot of good conversation. There's just no way that we can have the detailed discussion today or in this format that I would love to have. But I did just want to make several points. And, starting with the mantra of keeping forests as forests, what I'm afraid that we're falling into, the trap that I think has been set for all of you as kind of policymakers here, is that I think where we ended up with our presentations today is an endorsement of the status quo. And I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in the status quo as far as our forests are concerned. And the Global Warming Solutions Act and your charge is to put us on a different path than the one that we're on right now. And I'm just not seeing recommendations from either of the presenters that we heard from today that would do very much to shift us from where we are. In fact, if anything, they would push us towards greater wood consumption, which we heard early on in Tony's presentation is not a direction that we want to go, and greater wood burning perhaps as well. And from a carbon perspective, we've, I think, conclusively, heard that, that is just absolutely the opposite of what we need in terms of emissions. So there's a false choice being presented here between more wood products, more forest active management, and keeping forests intact. We've made a decision as a society time and time again that, this is a decision that we want to present landowners with, this false choice, log or subdivide, right? And use value appraisal basically endorses this idea and continues to, even with the recent changes that we've had. We do not value equally forests that are left alone. So if we really do want to talk about options, there are a lot more options than what we actually afford to landowners today. And I would love to have that more of that kind of conversation in this group. I want to fact check a few things real quick, and then I'll sign off. We lose, and this is not to say that carbon is the only value that we want to emphasize in forest management, but you are tasked with reducing carbon emissions, right? That is the goal of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And let's just look at the facts. 86% of all of the carbon that is lost from our forests every year here in the Northeast is from logging. 86%. 3% of the carbon that is lost from forests every year is from forest conversion. This is from a USDA funded study, 2016, Harris et al. It's an excellent study, widely cited. And I hope that you will all take a close look at what it found. The modeling that's been done by Wildlands and Woodlands, Harvard Forest, it shows that over the next 50 years, we will continue to see the vast majority of carbon losses from logging, not from forest conversion. And the numbers in terms of the acreage of forest that is lost per year in New England and in Vermont, there are wildly different numbers being thrown around. And I've seen very different numbers from what we were presented with just a little bit earlier today, showing that conversion really just is not the threat that we make it out to be on the large scale, as an ecosystem scale, at a meaningful scale for climate, for biodiversity. Really, it's logging that is the greatest driver of kind of forest structure in New England and forest health. And so I want to make sure that we're really fact checking what we're hearing, and that we're not ending up with a situation where you're all coming away with thinking everything's hunky dory. Keep the focus on, kind of maintaining forest cover and canopy cover as kind of a proxy for forest health, which gets us right back into the mess that we're in right now with the our forests not producing the ecosystem services, including carbon storage, that we really need them to. So I think you're probably on information overload right now. And I present these, facts to hopefully provide some more context and perspective, but I realize that it's a lot of info after you've already heard a lot of information. And I just hope that there will be more opportunities for that kind of fact checking in the future before you make any policy recommendations. So looking forward to the future speakers that you have lined up. Thank you for the chance to comment.
Great, thanks, Zach. I'm aware of the time, and we're about at end of time.
Can we just let Tony respond to that? Because I think
Cheryl, let me just, I will, 1 second. And this will open up a whole debate, which we do not have. We have 4 minutes.
No, I think Zach mischaracterized what Tony was
really
presenting, so I want to allow Tony a chance to.
Yeah, let me talk. I just want to absolutely try. I want to let Tony a chance to respond. And I know this opens up a whole conversation, so I just want to acknowledge that. But Tony, go ahead. I think you should have a fair chance to respond to speaker.
Yeah, I mean, I guess me laying a trap or not speaking of facts, I don't necessarily think that was the intent here. And so I think the key element of all of this is that we're dealing with a global issue, which is carbon, climate change, and our consumption. And so we do need to reduce consumption by 25%, right? I think just generally as a region, right, not just Vermont, if we eliminate logging, let's just take it off the table, regardless of carbon, let's just eliminate logging. Or just,
This is the mischaracterization right here, and I'm going to jump in to say that nobody is suggesting to end logging, and I really want to hammer on this because to take it.
Zach, I think let's hang tight. Again, this is a whole conversation. I want Tony to finish, and then we're going to wrap for today. So Tony,
I guess my point being is that I think if you look at any of my publications, any of the objective work I do, I'm about carbon, I'm about old forests, I'm about biodiversity. But I think one of the challenges is that we use resources. So, as a region, we have to look at this fact that, there's this land use logging that I agree with, it reduces above ground biomass. So we're going to see a reduction in carbon stocks on that site when, the science is there. We've done a lot of work showing that science. So if we view that, and again, you might say I'm mischaracterizing it. Zach, you did kind of paint a picture there that was like worse than development, which is a hard loss, right? It's gone. If you love forest, it is no longer a forest to love ever, right? And so in 200 years, it's not going to be forest. Might be a few species growing up through the cracked sidewalk, but so when we're thinking about kind of the regional future of New England, part of why that illusion of preservation is critical is we were also following in the old trap of kind of the not in my backyard. We use these things, but we don't like what it looks like. Maybe when we see logging, we don't like maybe what the carbon stock component is. The Northeast is still obviously gaining as a carbon sink, but it's certainly, you know, when there's harvesting, that those locations, right, you see it goes down there, it's going up in other areas, it's a larger balance. And that map that showed Maine, I think really speaks to kind of that Harvard Forest work, you know, that really influences that estimate, right? We are very much relying heavily on Maine, you know, and as I always like to point out, I blissfully consumed tons of wood products from that landscape when I was growing up in Eastern Massachusetts. Had no idea, you know, like that, all the magazines, all the things that I was just kind of using. You know, where's it come from? When I first saw it, I'm like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to the earth. They're cutting the forest, but wasn't tying together that, you know, we're using this resource. And so I think part of the roadmap going forward is not the status quo. We need to stop consuming as much wood as we're consuming. We need to think about not just the ecological implications, but also the social dynamics of us deciding as a state, deciding as a region to still consume at a certain rate, but not think about where that wood's coming from and what the impacts of that wood are. And so part of what I was getting at is that we need this balanced approach: wildlands, unmanaged areas, protected areas permanently, woodlands, areas that are not going to be developed, but at the same time, you know, have the potential for management. I'm not saying that 70% of the landscape is going to be logged, right? It's just that there's an option there over time that that's one land use that could be, you know, allowable as well as syrup. So, you know, or any other you know, values from those systems. So I think, you know, that Harvard Forest paper really looks at, you know, if it looked at hard change to non-forest, right? That Duveneck and Thompson work that simulated forward, you know, those areas over time that are also being developed have now houses, more fossil fuel consumption. There's a lot of stuff happening in those places. So it's not as simple as just saying that that spot flips off the map to non-forest. There are other impacts associated with that development and change. And so I'm not, you know, being accused of trying to set a trap or being accused of how to, you know, like speaking in things that aren't fact. You know, when we look at that 25% reduction of consumption, Vermont actually will need to kind of counterbalance the fact that Maine is reducing. We need to reduce some of the production we're relying on Maine for. I think it's unfair, right, that we kind of target one state or one region as kind of the shoulder the majority of our wood needs. And I just think we need to be factoring more of the kind of social and ecological components, not just like this is going to be bad for carbon in this one spot in the ground, which again, the worst thing for carbon in that spot in the ground is to put in development. I mean, I think that's irrefutable fact. You know, like a 1 acre harvest that's going to regenerate versus a 1 acre development. I think that is a known, that's not, the development is worse than the harvest. I would the science is pretty clear on that.
So I think this is again an important debate, and one that you were at the end of a meeting as we begin to open up, and this is clearly a topic that Script may want to explore in much more detail. So I think I just wanted to check to see if I know I have to jump, but if other people Jane can stay on and keep the meeting open for another 15. Charlie, you have to jump. Judy, you can stay on. Anybody else who has to jump from the working group perspective? I just want to see how many folks we have left, if we can have a conversation or not.
I'll stay if we have business and we need to cover, but I plan for these meetings as scheduled, and in the future, I hope that we stick to the agenda.
So I think the questions of logging, land conversion, carbon impact, impacts on resilience in forests, you know, old growth, older growth, new sequestration versus storage, these are all legitimate questions that were raised. And Zach raised an important alternative viewpoint for further discussion. So I think the question is how to tease some of this up going forward. So this is kind of opening that up, and then we have to figure out what this working group and how we have this conversation. I think Cheryl Joy suggested an additional presenter potentially from MIT. If people have other ideas to kind of further highlight this kind of discussion or debate, then, you know, people let us know who that may be. Jane, I think if people want to kind of talk for a little bit more, I'll turn it over to you. And I know I have to jump, but maybe you can keep the meeting open for a bit of discussion for the next 10 minutes. Jane, go ahead.
Yep. Yeah, I just wanted to say that we have meetings now on the books for next week and the 21st that are full of speakers. And then if folks wanted to have a straight meeting, the council meeting in October, there is a September 28th. At this point, I'd like to suggest the approach that if there are other speakers who are interested in coming in, or topics of focus, similar to how Billy was able to manage today's meeting by scheduling presenters for me. At this point, I need to ask for support in scheduling additional presenters. So we have a meeting, I'll just say a date that's open the morning of September 28th, and folks can reach out to me if there's a topic, and I can try to coordinate if there's a majority interest in exploring that topic in an additional meeting. And again, I unfortunately am the regional point person for climate on a meeting that I have to present at shortly. So happy to let the discussion keep going, but need to jump within the next 10 minutes. Is there any other comments?